This is the Duke's Research Natural Area. It's located on the Hiawatha National Forest in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This was established in 1974, and it's also embedded within the Duke's Experimental Forest. This was originally set aside in the 1930s, not called a Research Natural Area at that time, but called a reserve for the number of cutting treatments that were going on in the experimental forest. In the 1930s, the researchers at that time set up a grid of plots to start understanding how the natural processes and dynamics of hemlock northern hardwoods would work. So today we still have 238 of those plots in this research natural area, and that results in an 84-year record. Some of this data is publicly available, and you can look that up later on the available website. In general, the goal was to understand old growth dynamics for hemlock hardwoods. And so it was very forward thinking at that time to be putting plots in this area, to be thinking about that, because at that time most of the science was going into how to tame this wild forest and make it into something productive. One thing that the researchers observed was that there appeared to be multiple age classes growing together in the hemlock hardwoods, so uneven age management seemed to be an appropriate tool. So there was some aging research done early on that suggested, yes, there were more than 3 age classes in this forest here at the Research Natural Area. Some of those ages going up to 400 years. And more recent research confirms this notion in this area. With these plots, we've been able to look at natural disturbances over the 84-year record. And it confirms other research in the area that about 10% of the patches in here are affected by very small, low severity disturbances, so individual tree mortality as a result of fungi or insects or small blowdowns. And over this 84-year record, we saw at the beginning a moderate severity disturbance, and more recently another moderate severity disturbance. And that's what we expect over the lifetime of the tree, about 1 to 2 times a moderate severity disturbance. So this record that we're seeing here confirms some of the regional research. One thing that the research here also has indicated is patchiness in growth, so patches of yellow birch, patches of hemlock, and patchy age structure, suggesting that these moderate severity disturbances are important to developing these stands. That patchiness indicates that in uneven age management that we can not only be thinking about something like the selection systems like group and single tree selection, but also irregular shelter wood, which is a silvicultural system that's been gaining interest in recent years to have more irregular structures. And that's how these natural areas such as the Duke's Research Natural Area looks. With the age classes aren't equally spaced. They seem more irregular in time and irregular spatially. So something like the regular shelter wood could be also an appropriate tool for these systems. The Duke's Natural Research Area has no cutting, or very little cutting as far as we know. There was an elm camp in the experimental forest section of this area where they're collecting elm to make hoops for barrels. So there potentially could have been a little bit of elm cut out of this research natural area, but as far as we know, this is a late successional old growth forest. There was no notes in the 1930s about cut stumps or logging at that time. This forest is composed of sugar maple, hemlock, white pine, yellow birch, ash, some cherry, and a little bit of beech. In the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, we're on the western range of the northern hardwood forest type, and we're just on the edge of the beech, literally speaking. So a few of the plots here at the Research Natural Area do have beech in them. In terms of natural disturbance, moderate severity disturbances are an important thing that we're learning about here. In 2005, there was a moderate severity wind disturbance. Wind is one of the driving natural disturbances for this forest type. And when we think about wind, it's a top-down disturbance, so it's usually taking out the biggest trees, toppling them over, or snapping them off. And that action and that process creates important outcomes for the sustainability of this forest type. For example, hemlock, rotten logs are really important to regenerating hemlock. So having that process happen. And the same thing for uprooted trees, creating that exposed mineral soil and that mixing of organic matter and mineral soil together and that elevated position are really important for species like yellow birch to get established. So some of the things we're learning here indicate for some objectives and managed stands, we may want to protect some of these features to enhance natural regeneration of some of the less common species in the stand, such as eastern hemlock and yellow birch. Another thing we've learned from this natural area is looking at age structures. Many of them are very irregular in time and patchy spatially. So we've seen two moderate severity disturbances, and they are in spatially different places over the 84-year record that we have. So both that spatial irregularity and over time irregularity of cohorts being established indicate uneven age management is a suitable idea for managing these types of forests. It also indicates that our traditional thoughts, which are often on regulation and getting things very even in time, spatially, and in terms of developing new age classes over time, which would be appropriate, but also there's room for irregularity, and that would be more similar to what we're seeing in these natural areas. So something like irregular shelterwood could be an appropriate approach for this forest type. In the 1920s, much of the northern hardwoods on this part of the northern hardwood range had been cut over, except for here in the upper peninsula of Michigan. About a third of it remained in late successional status, or old growth. With a third of the northern hardwood resource in late successional status here in the upper peninsula of Michigan, there were some companies interested in staying and not leaving and moving west. One of them was the Cleveland Cliffs Incorporated out of Marquette. They joined forces with the government to begin research on partial cuttings for northern hardwoods. At that time, many of the practices were clear cutting or just taking what that company wanted out of the forest and then moving on. It was very controversial at that time to think about taking some trees and leaving some trees. When I look back in the Journal of Forestry in the 1920s, in the letters to the editor, there was commentary on, yes, we can do this with northern hardwoods when we look at their natural dynamics and so forth. And then there was other letters saying, we can't do that, that's leaving money on the table. The rest of those trees are just gonna blow down. You have to take it and move on. So Cleveland Cliffs Incorporated donated a half section of land to the U.S. Forest Service. The research branch was just starting at that time. Raphael Zone, who was the chief of research under Gifford Pinchot, was the first director of research here in the Lake States, and he was here at the Duke's Experimental Forest to set up this experiment. He was a strong believer that we could do partial cuttings in northern hardwoods and be sustainable. And this was the place to do it because we had support from industry to get this kind of research on the ground. With the half section of land donated, Cleveland Cliffs wanted a range of practices looked at, both what was being done in contemporary times, such as clear cutting and diameter limit cutting, but also start investigating these ideas about selection that were coming out of Europe. They weren't tested here in the US, so we weren't sure if this was the right thing to do. And with the different cutting practices that would be on this half section, the government would pay back Cleveland Cliffs for that land. Well, that did happen over the decades, and today the Duke's Experimental Forest is about 5,500 acres in size, so it's grew. Many research studies have been established since then. So the research at the Dukes, when it started in the 1920s, was science as it was done then. At that time, they would apply a treatment and put in one large plot. So 1 acre plot where they'd measure a lot of details. That's different than what we do today, where we would use more individual small plots. So there's no replication in this study, but it plays a really important role in developing American forestry. It's some of the earliest information that we have on silvicultural treatments, and it's also the longest record that we have for northern hardwood silviculture in its range. So that includes the Northeast and southern Canada as well, even though there were other research started in those regions by the 1930s. So this work has been influential in textbooks. It's been influential in developing uneven age management in general in the United States. So it's very important historical context. And part of that reason is because it was based on empirical or real observations in the field of how selection can work from a structural guide, looking at that diameter distribution that was based on real data coming from the field, not from a calculation or more mathematical type of probability to understand sustainable management. So that brings a unique information that's been carried forth in many different ways in American forestry. Right now we're standing in the single tree selection. This was first cut in 1928. It's been cut 3 times, with the most recent harvest in 2009. The idea here was to improve the quality of the stand and produce high quality saw timber in those upper size classes. The goal was a reverse J distribution, a structural distribution to manage the stand, so high number of saplings, medium number of poles, and few saw log sized trees, with those being high quality veneer, if possible, quality type of saw logs. Now, when this treatment was first put in, single tree selection was not in the textbook. Again, there were no textbooks at that time. They called it the over mature and defective treatment because that was the goal. They wanted to start, quote unquote, making this a thrifty stand, and that meant in this forest, which has not been cut over, this is an old growth forest that was being put into management, start removing these over mature and defective trees. Didn't matter the size, any size, didn't matter on the spacing. Let's start experimenting with this. With doing that, it was very controversial at the time because you were taking out the worst trees and leaving the best. That was opposite of what was happening at that time. But what they found over the research and over the decades was that it did improve the quality of the stand. Sugar maple has an incredible response capability, so growth increased across all the diameter classes. They knew based on aging the trees that there were already multiple age classes here, so uneven age management would be a potential. And they found that this structure, that reverse J, could be emulated here. Now, it took 20 years of research for the big publication to come out, a monograph. It was 124 pages, and very diverse information, important information on ecology, insects, disease, fire, slash, all sorts of things about the northern hardwoods here in the Lake States. While that was a very important publication, what really brought out the work here at the Dukes was a manager's guide that came out in 1957, and that was written by Arbogast. From what I understand, he was a very passionate scientist. He strongly believed in selection, in particular single tree selection. And so he wrote this guide to pull out some of those elements that were in that larger 124-page document to make it practical so it could be done in the woods. With that, and because of his skill in educating, this became known in the Lake States region as the Arbogast Guide, because it became very famous idea to have the sustainable production of trees, having multiple age classes, continuous cover, developing high quality saw logs. This was meeting the needs and the interests of many groups over in this region and in this part of the northern hardwoods. In our memos, we have memos from the Menominee Indian tribe, National Forests, industry, indicating they were interested and wanted to learn how to do this and would come out here for trainings to learn more. These ideas were also taken to the Argonne Experimental Forest. So when the big publication and the guide came out in the 1950s, unfortunately most of that late successional forest that was in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was cut over. So Michigan, along with Wisconsin and Minnesota, had these second growth forests coming up. So the questions were, could what we have learned at the Duke's Experimental Forest be applied to second growth forest? And that wasn't known. Second growth forests are very different. They're even aged, much younger in age. So at that time, in the 1950s, the studies at the Argonne Experimental Forest were started, and scientists such as Carl Arbogast himself were transferred there to begin applying these ideas there to learn more. Some of the outcomes from this stand include a structure, the diameter distribution that's been very sustainable over time, meaning they've been able to come in and cut to that curve and multiple times, seeing good growth throughout the diameter classes. The composition is strongly skewed towards sugar maple. In most cases today, in this part of the northern hardwood range, we'd be using groups in addition to single tree selection to bring in some diversity into these stands. Testing new ideas was important in this study. In particular, testing partial cuttings, such as selection. This is one of the selection treatments that was tested. The idea here was to maintain that reverse J distribution in terms of the diameter, structural development, and also to have a lower maximum DBH. So that was set at 17 inches for this stand. So you'll notice this study started in the 1920s when this was late successional or old growth forest, and today this has been cut at least 4 times. That overall the stand diameter is much smaller, even though we've been coming in with partial cuts for decades, and that's because of that truncated distribution that ends at 17 inches. Overall, the structure has been maintained. The composition is heavily skewed towards sugar maple, and regeneration, because it is largely sugar maple, has been maintained. It's very shade tolerant and can respond to these partial cuttings well. This is the group selection treatment. This was one of the new ideas at the time. Could you take some and leave some? Could you take some in patches and leave some in patches? Over time, this has been applied 5 times to the stand, the first time in 1928 and most recently in 2009. The openings over time have been anywhere from a 1/10 acre to a 1/3 acre in size. They've been applied very systematically on a grid system, and also they've been applied more opportunistically, looking at where there may have been over mature trees where they could take those out as a clump and putting in as a gap. All very experimental. Back in the 1920s, group selection wasn't even part of the textbook at that time, so it was trying different things. The main idea, because this area is only 5 acres in size, so trying to demonstrate a full silvicultural system is difficult on such a small land base. But the main idea was to experiment with creating groups or canopy gaps in these managed stands, and what could they do in terms of shifting composition was the main goal. There was more success with this earlier in the study compared to today. Today we're looking at one of the more recent canopy gaps from 2009. One of the dominant species that we see in the sapling layer is ironwood, and ironwood has low commercial value It's aggressive though in coming in these areas once they're released. And it's also a stump sprouter, so it's not as simple as coming through with a brush saw and removing these. More aggressive methods such as herbicides, or more of a scarification or disking, or more ground layer interruption would be important to interrupt an ironwood layer. The other thing that we see here is a strong shrub layer coming in, so a lot of berries coming in this area. And this is really typical in our contemporary times when we open up our northern hardwood stands. So what changed between the 1920s and now? It could be our elevated deer populations that we see in the area, and putting in these openings in a relatively continuous, mature forest may have disproportionately attracted deer to these areas, and the deer ate yellow birch and sugar maple, some of its more preferred species, leaving something like ironwood, which is not a preferred species. And also, with the number of entries that have been in here, exhausting and adding to that seed bank, so something like raspberry we have seen an uprise in many of our cuttings compared to old cuttings from the 1920s. And part of that, we believe, is birds and other species bringing in seed to those areas, and something like raspberry seed can last for up to 100 years. So we've had time with the opening up the forest and so forth to change some of those dynamics that over time lead to different responses, which is important of why we want to keep studying our silvicultural systems, because we might be applying the same thing, but the forest and these ecosystems are always changing. So it's important to maintain long-term silvicultural studies. In the group selection, we still see evidence of those early treatments on the stand. Right now we can see a group selection patch. We typically see the yellow birch coming in clumps from those group selections that were done decades ago. So we have about 5 or 6 behind me, and we can see some of the original edge trees right here that made up this gap. Now remember, this forest was never cut over, so some of these original gap trees, edge trees, are here. They're over 100 years old and they're still standing here today. From our research on the group selection, over 8 decades of information, what we've seen is that reverse J curve, where we have a high number of saplings, medium number of poles, few saw logs, is maintained in this treatment. It's a very high residual basal area, but we see that variety in age, diameter sizes. And we know from studies and looking at the ages of these trees that it is a multiple age stand. Interestingly, this is also the most diverse treatment that we see from our data. Quite a bit of yellow birch, which that was a goal, to develop some silvicultural techniques to increase and maintain yellow birch in these stands. And also it's been, for the most part until more recent years, been successful in regeneration. Today, for putting in some of the gaps, we'll be thinking about things such as doing more scarification to break up that ground layer, herbicide treatments if it's a more dire situation. We also been thinking about enrichment planting, by planting the species that we want in there and using fencing to keep out deer. So a range of options to continue to make it successful today, even though the conditions are quite different than when the study started in the 20s. This is the 22-inch diameter limit. This was one of the treatments that was emulating some of the cutting practices at the time. Today we might call it cherry picking, where you're only taking the largest tree out of the stand. At that time, much of industry was built around saw logs, and very large saw logs to meet building and other material needs in the Midwest. So here, this continues today. So the first harvest was in 1929, and it's been cut 5 times at this 22-inch diameter limit, with the most recent cut being in 2009. What we're seeing with this practice is it is taking the most largest trees with the most well-developed crowns. So it's essentially emulating some natural processes, creating large canopy gaps with every 22-inch and larger tree that's cut out of here. Those crowns can be 30, 40 feet in diameter. And behind me you can see the number of saplings responding to this. And sugar maple has an incredible shade tolerance, so it can wait in the understory for decades for this opportunity and then in large numbers take over that gap. So some of the general outcomes that we see from the 22-inch diameter limit is that it does carry that reverse J curve. So high number of saplings, medium number of poles, and few saw logs. And this again is probably because we're focusing on the largest trees that create canopy gaps, a similar process to what we see in the natural areas and how they're replacing themselves. Another outcome is the composition is strongly towards sugar maple. We're losing out some of the other species in the stand because of the heavy shade being maintained throughout the stand and sugar maple being very shade tolerant. We're on the edge of the beech range. There's no beech in this particular stand, but if this would be just a little bit to the east, probably beech would be in the understory as well. In general, this method hasn't been recommended because it doesn't work on the quality of the stand. The composition is too much towards one species, leaving less options for management, and the growth isn't as high as it could be in other treatments. This is the 12-inch diameter limit. This treatment was another that was replicating what was happening on the landscape at the time, some of the cutting practices. So the idea here was to take just saw logs from the treatment, from the stand. This began in 1928. It's been cut 3 times to that 12-inch diameter limit, with the most recent one being in 2009. What we see over time in the stand is poor quality trees. So with taking out all those saw logs, they're causing a lot of residual damage on any seedlings and saplings in the understory. We see a lot of multiple stemmed trees, and we also see a lot of stump sprouting. So in general, while the 3 cuts probably had trees that were okay for providing a commercial harvest, what we see coming in now in future harvests is very low quality, making it difficult to have a sustainable forestry operation in this type of stand. Composition, it is variable. There is a number of sugar maple, as you can see, but there's other species that do come in because it's so open after these harvests that other species, lower shade tolerance, are able to seed in. Overall stand size is small, and at this point, what would we do with this stand? Well, there's an opportunity to start over. Thinking more about using something like a shelter wood or a regular shelter wood. Trying to implement something like uneven age management may be difficult because the quality of the remaining stems are so poor and had damage over time. That'd be, for a forestry operation with some economic objectives, it would be important to get high quality stems into the stand so there's a more opportunity to meet that objective in the future. For ecological opportunities, some of the defects that we see in here are opportunities for habitat, but again, there has to be a balance between those two in a managed stand if we want feasible operations to maintain this over time. This is the Clearcut treatment. It was first cut in 1927, and the goal of this was to emulate some of the practices at the time. So clear cutting everything that was merchantable, everything 4.5 inches and larger, which meant there were some saplings left. So today, 80 some years later, this is the resulting stand. It has been thinned one time in 2009 to bring down the residual basal area. But you can see it's still quite a dense stand, very uniform in size. There is some diversity in this stand because of how open it was back in 1927. So we do see some ash and birch and basswood in this stand. The structure of the stand is very typical of an even age stand, so more of a bell-shaped curve. And we're at a point in time of 85 years old that we're beginning to see some invasion of the understory by sugar maple, so largely one species coming in this stand. So at this point, if we were going to do any management actions, something like a natural shelter wood is occurring, and if we remove that, we'd probably have a primarily sugar maple stand that would result from this. At this point, the stand is being managed as an even age stand, so it has a couple more thinnings on the docket, and then the plan would be to do another clear cut in the future and maintain this treatment over time. So one other thing to note is that this clear cut was about 2.5 acres in size, and today we wouldn't always call that a clear cut system. We might call that a patch cutting system. So the results we're looking at here aren't in the same context of a 40-acre type of clear cut. So there is still some shading around the edge of this treatment, and there's a lot of edge trees that could bring in seed to this stand. In this part of the western range of the northern hardwoods, if we have natural regeneration like this, we could consider the clear cut system if there's enough natural regeneration happening. Otherwise, it's generally not recommended. They did have in the notes for this treatment patches of berries and grasses coming in instead of trees, so there was some delay in regeneration to getting to the stand that we see today.